This is Chapter 5, Lipids, Triglycerides, Phospholipids, and Cholesterol from Smollen's Nutrition Science and Applications for Nutrition 230. So when we look at lipids is the chemical term for fat. It contributes texture, flavor, and aroma to foods. Fats and oils contain 9 kilocalories per gram, as opposed to carbohydrates and protein, which only contain 4 kilocalories per gram. The typical American diet contains about 34% of its energy from fat, which falls into the AMDR of 20 to 35%. However, it's the types of fats that Americans aren't doing so well on, as we eat a lot more saturated and trans fat, as well as polyunsaturated fats such as omega-6 fatty acids, and not quite enough monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats from omega-3 fatty acids. So when we look at fat in food, fats in our traditional, oils and animal products, but is also found in some trace amounts with, different meats, different dairy, as well as even the fruit group, some avocado, nuts and seeds. And then, of course, we eat a little bit too much fat from some of the sources such as muffins and croissants and cakes and things like that. Triglycerides are our major source of lipids in the diet and in the body. Triglycerides are made of a glycerol backbone connected with 3 fatty acids, and those fatty acids can be variable in length from short chain to medium chain to long chain fatty acids. As you can see on the bottom here, fatty acids are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen on that carboxyl end that attaches to the glycerol. And then there's a methyl end or an omega end on the other side. The fatty acids, depending on how many carbons there are, depends on whether they're called long, medium, or short chain. And then also, depending on where double bonds are, it depends on if they're called omega-3 or omega-6 or monounsaturated or polyunsaturated or saturated fats. So the carbon chains of fatty acids that are short are from 4 to 7 carbons, and they're liquid at colder temperatures. So for example, milk would be a short chain fatty acid. Medium chain fatty acids range from 8 to 12 carbons, and they solidify when they're chilled, but they're liquid at room temperature. And those would be coconut oils. Long chain fatty acids are usually solid at room temperature, and that would be something like beef fat or butter, something like that. So when we look at fatty acids, we can see that there are a number of different types. So there are basically either saturated fats, which have no double bonds on the chain, and unsaturated fats, which have at least one double bond. Monounsaturated fats have a single double bond. These are found in canola, olive, and peanut oil, as well as nuts and avocados. Saturated fats are found in more animal products as well as in coconut oil. Polyunsaturated fats contain more than one carbon-carbon double bond, and the 2 polyunsaturated fats that we talk about in nutrition are our omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids. These 2 are essential fatty acids, but we tend to get too much omega-6 in our diet and too little omega-3. Omega-6 is found in corn oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, and nuts. Now, corn oil and soybean oil are typically used in a lot of processed foods, whereas omega-3 fatty acids are going to be found in flaxseed, canola oil, nuts, as well as fish oils. Trans fatty acids are still in our food supply in a small amount. We've been eliminating trans fatty acids from the U.S. food supply over the past few years, but we often can find trans fatty acids from a process called hydrogenation. And we'll see this type of fatty acid in things like crackers, cookies, biscuits, shortening, so that would be like stick margarine and things like that, whole milk, ground beef, and milk chocolate also have some trace amounts of trans fat in them in more natural form. And when we talk about foods being different types of saturated fat, it really isn't that simple. Different foods just contain different ratios of fatty acid types. So as you can see, we tend to call our tuna, for example, we say tuna is high in omega-3s, but that doesn't mean that tuna doesn't have a little bit of saturated fat and some monounsaturated fat and some omega-6s as well. Phospholipids are another lipid type. Now, phospholipids look similar to triglycerides, but you can see that instead of the third fatty acid coming off the chain, there's a phosphate group that kind of flips that last bond around on the chain, giving the phospholipid a water-soluble head and a fat-soluble tail. This makes it a great consistency for our cell membranes. So we have a phospholipid bilayer in our cell membranes, which make the cell membranes semi-permeable. And so here is showing how phospholipids can emulsify. So as you can see, phospholipids can surround little oil droplets, creating a little bit more surface area of that oil in an aqueous or watery environment. Cholesterol is another type of lipid. Sterols are a whole class of lipids. We have some sterols in our body. Vitamin D is a sterol. Different hormones such as estrogen and progesterone and testosterone are sterols. And then we have dietary cholesterol. This is not an essential nutrient, but it is part of the diet. Dietary guidelines, as you can see here, recommended that we got less than 300 milligrams of cholesterol a day until the most recent guidelines in 2015, which now don't put limits on cholesterol. So we once thought dietary cholesterol would really raise our overall cholesterol in our blood, but now we're finding that that's not so true. Now, when we look at lipid digestion and absorption, lipid digestion is a little bit more complicated than carbohydrate digestion because we first need to emulsify lipids in order to increase the surface area of the fatty acid droplets before we can absorb lipids and digest them. So a little bit of digestion occurs in the mouth and in the stomach. There's an enzyme called lingual lipase in the mouth and an enzyme called gastric lipase in the stomach. However, most digestion doesn't occur until the small intestines, when the liver produces bile, which is stored in the gallbladder and then released into the small intestines. Bile mixes with lipids, creating this product called a micelle. The micelle contains some digested lipids, partially digested lipids, as well as bile acids. The pancreas produces an enzyme called pancreatic lipase. This is released into the small intestines to break down triglycerides. And when bile mixes with the partially digested lipids, there's an ability for the pancreatic lipase to do a little bit better job digesting, and then two, the micelles are able to move close to the microvilli to diffuse those lipids into the mucosal cells. Once the lipids are inside the mucosal cells, fatty acids and monoglycerides get reassembled into triglycerides. Then they're incorporated into lipid transport particles called lipoproteins or chylomicrons, which then enter the lymph. Since fat absorption in the small intestines is very efficient, there's very little fat normally lost in the feces. And if you have fat in your feces, which would make your feces float in the toilet, that's usually a sign that there's some sort of malabsorption going on. Now, lipoproteins I mentioned are packaged in the micelles, or packaged in the mucosal cells. So lipoproteins are packaged in the mucosal cells of the small intestines, and these are transport particles for water-insoluble lipids. They're created by combining water-insoluble lipids with phospholipids and proteins. This creates a water-soluble outer layer and a fat-soluble inner layer. Lipoproteins will help transport triglycerides, cholesterol, and fat-soluble vitamins from the small intestines and store lipids from the liver. And they pass through the lymph and then are emptied into the blood. So the lymph is where all lipoproteins need to go after the mucosal cells, whereas the carbohydrates and the proteins go directly into the blood, to the portal vein, and then to the liver. So this is what a lipoprotein looks like, and there are a few different types of lipoproteins, and they're really just named for the ratio of each type of component that's in them. So we have cholesterol esters, triglycerides, cholesterol, phospholipids, and protein. So the ratio of triglycerides, cholesterol, phospholipids, and protein in each particle will determine its name. So when dietary fat is absorbed into the mucosal cell of the small intestines, the first lipoprotein, or the chylomicron, is formed. This then enters the lymph and drains into the blood. Chylomicrons circulate the blood, delivering triglycerides to different body cells. There's an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, which is present on the surface of cells lining the blood vessels, and this breaks down the triglycerides in the chylomicrons into fatty acids and glycerol. Then these enter surrounding cells to do a variety of things in terms of fatty acid functions. Chylomicron remnants then travel to the liver to be disassembled. At this point, VLDL, or very low density lipoprotein, is formed in the liver and released back into the blood. They function similarly to chylomicrons because both of them deliver triglycerides to body cells with the help of that enzyme I mentioned before, lipoprotein lipase. After the VLDLs have dropped enough triglycerides off at the cells, they become IDLs, and the IDL particles that remain are removed and are either returned to the liver or are transformed in the blood into LDL, or low density lipoprotein. So VLDL is very low density lipoprotein, IDL is intermediate density lipoprotein, and LDL is low density lipoprotein. So LDL particles' job is to deliver cholesterol to cells. LDL particles bind to receptors in the cell membrane. This allows the LDL particle to enter the cell where cholesterol and other components can be used. There's one last type of lipoprotein which is called HDL, or high density lipoprotein. HDL particles pick up cholesterol from lipoproteins in body cells and return them to the liver in order to make bile. Some of the cholesterol is broken down and some of it's transported to organs with high requirements, such as cholesterol, such as those that synthesize the different steroid hormones, such as estrogen and progesterone and testosterone and vitamin D. So as you can see here, I mentioned before, the lipoprotein composition is really going to affect what the lipoprotein is called. So chylomicrons, as you can see here, contain the largest ratio of triglycerides. VLDL are next up. LDL contains the largest ratio of cholesterol, and HDLs have the highest ratio of protein. Lipids function in the body in terms of their storage as adipose tissue that can be body shape defining. It can help provide stored energy. It can insulate the body from temperature changes, and it can also protect internal organs against physical shock. Lipids in the body are used for a number of other purposes as well, such as lubrication, mucous membranes of the eyes, for example. Cholesterol can be used, as I mentioned before, to make the sex hormones as well as cortisol. And polyunsaturated fatty acids help to regulate blood pressure and blood clotting. Our omega-6 fatty acids help to increase inflammation, for example, and our omega-3 fatty acids help to decrease inflammation. We have two essential fatty acids, omega-6 and omega-3. Essential fatty acids are important for the growth, skin integrity, fertility, and then structure and function of cell membranes. Eicosanoids are made from omega-3s and omega-6s. They're going to help regulate blood clotting, blood pressure, and immune function. If adequate amounts of essential fatty acids aren't consumed, a deficiency can result. Symptoms of essential fatty acid deficiency include dry and scaly skin, liver abnormalities, poor wound healing, growth failure in infants, as well as impaired hearing and vision. As you can see here, our omega-6s and omega-3s are consumed from dietary sources. Omega-6 turns into arachidonic acid, omega-3 turns into eicosapentaenoic acid, or docosahexaenoic acid. And then these are used in order to either increase inflammation, blood clotting, and blood pressure, or decrease inflammation, blood clotting, and blood pressure.